All right. After World War II, the Cold War will begin. It'll be a conflict fought without bullets between Eastern countries and Western countries, so-called, relatively speaking, between the Soviet Union and the United States and Great Britain and France and other countries, between the Warsaw Pact eventually and NATO. And so what you're going to see is the rise of two powers who are fighting at the beginning for different ideologies, for land, for power, for control, and it's going to continue throughout most of the 20th century. So from the end of World War II almost to the end of the 20th century. And then the effects are even going to be continued today. In fact, many people are beginning to think that there's a beginning of a new Cold War. If you search for that term, you're going to see a lot of recent articles published in popular media asking the question, are we facing a new Cold War between, again, those same powers, although they're not called the Warsaw Pact and NATO anymore, but the same countries, those Eastern countries with traditionally more communistic influences, Russia and other Eastern countries, and then the United States and Great Britain and other countries part of the NATO alliance. And so it's something that we're still feeling today, we're going to be dealing with for a very long time. There are people who have lived through that, who experienced the constant dread and fear of the Cold War, and those memories are going to affect decisions and policies and relationships for years to come. It takes a very long time to undo what a few bad decisions and a few hot tempers will bring about. And so when we get to the end of World War II, this is what the map kind of looks like over in Germany. The big question is what to do with all the land that has been covered up or taken by the different Allied armies. Germany will be demilitarized, it will be occupied, and you can see here that there are 4 different nations in these regions occupying Germany. You have Great Britain, the United States, France, and Russia. Here you have Berlin, and all 4 of those powers have a presence in Berlin. You can clearly see the demarcation here and what will become West Berlin and East Berlin. Russia has a large part of Berlin here, and then each one of those powers, the US, Great Britain, and France, all have a smaller portion. And eventually they'll link these together. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the leaders of these countries, of the UK in particular, not during the war until after France is retaken, because Germany has invaded and taken France. So after or during the war, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin will meet and at what is called the Yalta Conference. And there's different opinions at what to do, and this is a picture from the Yalta Conference. It's a very famous photo because you have all 3 of those leaders together taking a picture with one another. There was differing opinions amongst all 3 as to what they should do. Churchill had different ideas than Roosevelt and different ideas than Stalin, and Roosevelt's ideas were different than the other 2. In fact, Churchill and Roosevelt were both trying to go behind each other's backs to make deals with Stalin, which caused Stalin not to trust either one of them. If they weren't going to communicate well with one another, if they weren't going to deal open-handedly, if they weren't going to be, forthright with one another, then he recognized at that point that he can't trust either one of them. And so it's going to begin, the relationship between these 3 is going to begin on the wrong foot. Additionally, like we talked about last time, dealing with World War II and the fronts of the war, where the war is being fought, Stalin was begging Roosevelt and Churchill to begin a front in Europe. Please begin a front in Europe, for years. And they didn't. They went to Africa, and they went to Italy, and then finally, when they were ready to get around to it, they began the second front in Europe to kind of take some of the pressure off of the Russians. And so Stalin felt like he wasn't getting help from the other 2. He felt like he couldn't trust the other 2, and he was afraid that they were going to be very belligerent. And he had good reason to believe that. There were many high-ranking U.S. officials who just wanted to continue fighting. They met the Russians at the Elbe River. They wanted to just keep fighting, to push past them, defeat the Russians, take all of Europe, knock Russia out of the picture, and basically establish kind of a new world order. They wouldn't have called it that. They would have taken Stalin out of the picture and the idea was to allow democracy to take root in Russia. But there was a very big contingent in the leadership that wanted to do that. One in particular is George Patton, wanted to just keep rolling with the tanks. We're over here. He saw conflict as inevitable anyway, and he was very vocal with his idea to keep the fighting going. And Stalin wasn't ignorant of that, and so he was worried. He was, maybe worried is not the wrong word, he was concerned that he couldn't trust these people and that the fighting was going to begin again, and now his country, who lost more casualties, the Russians had more casualties than any other nation. There's more devastation and destruction in Russia than any other nation, and so his nation has been the hardest hit. The death toll is catastrophic, over 20 million. I think it's like 27 million dead in Russia. There's just the other Allied deaths are nowhere near that number, and so he has a good reason to be concerned, and he has a good reason to feel put out when the other two nations suggest that he shouldn't take territory that he has conquered, that he shouldn't be repaid, or that his nation shouldn't receive some kind of payment for the damage done. And basically what's going to happen at the end of World War II is that all the soil that Russian troops have taken, they will keep. They're not going to give things up. Poland will be annexed. Germany went in and had taken Poland. Russia will now keep it, at least part of it. You can see over here in this map where you have these like a beige area compared to the gray area. That's a state, the state of Poland that's actually running out of England. And here, this gray area here is going to belong to Russia. They're just going to keep everything that they took. And they feel like they have a right to it. The 27 million Russians, more than 27 million Russians were killed in this war. And there were entire armies, entire Russian armies that were killed defending cities, defending regions. They just felt like it was theirs now. They paid for it with their blood. And so there's going to be a lot of mistrust, a lot of unwillingness to budge as far as the leadership on both sides is going to be concerned. And so it's not a one-sided thing. We tend to, because we are on an opposite side from the Russians, we tend to view things from a very ethnocentric view, a geopolitical view where we're right and they're wrong. It doesn't help the fact that we tend to view our side as having won the Cold War, because the Soviet Union will come apart. Russia did not go away, but the Soviet Union, this centralized federal union that held together all the Soviets, all the other countries that had communist parties where they would establish Soviets, they kind of disintegrated, and so we feel like we won. However, Russia didn't go away, and they didn't lose. It's just kind of like they were giving up their territories, much like other nations have given up their territories. When the British left Rhodesia in Africa, it's Zimbabwe today. When the British left Rhodesia, they didn't lose. They just gave up that territory. And so that's kind of how it will be viewed from other perspectives. And so the important thing to keep in mind here is that there's many different perspectives, and we have to be very careful that we don't repeat the same mistakes that got us into the Cold War by not considering how the other side is viewing things and how the other side feels, just having come out of the bloodiest conflict in the history of the world, and having the highest casualty rate in the bloodiest conflict of the history of the world. And so it's going to be very important that we remember that we're dealing with human beings who have emotions. And so what's going to happen after World War II, you can kind of see here on this map, you have Russia in 1938, and then they're going to come and take these Soviet socialist republics right here. They're going to expand that forward, and they're going to have what are called the satellite states. These satellite states are going to allow to have their own governments that will kind of be overseen and influenced by the Russian government, by the USSR. And so what's going to happen is after the Yalta Conference, there's going to be another conference between Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, because Roosevelt will have died at that point. and it's going to be called the Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference. And there's clearly different intentions at that point, as Germany has already been defeated. They're focusing now on defeating Japan, and they clearly have different goals. And so basically what happens at the Potsdam Conference is you have the leaders of the world speaking together very heatedly, probably very brashly, without a great deal of wisdom, and it's going to sever, basically, the relationship between those three powers, at least between the USSR and the UK and US. UK and US will kind of have tenuous relationship there for a little while, but eventually they'll come together and they'll be friends again. And so what you're seeing, what's going to happen at the Potsdam Conference is Truman thinks that he's going to terrify Stalin into backing off and allowing the United States to kind of do what they want. And so Truman tells Stalin about the atomic bomb. He doesn't come out and say, hey, we've got an atomic bomb, but he says, we have a new bomb and it's absolutely devastating. And so he basically tells him we have an incredibly destructive weapon. The problem is, or the issue is, that Stalin already knew about it. You see, Stalin, after the Yalta Conference, he realized that these people are not going to do right. He felt that they were going to treat him unfairly, that they were going to stab him in the back, because they're doing it to each other at the Yalta Conference. And he began looking for information with more gusto than he was before. He was always interested in information about other powers, but especially after that. And so he knew about the A-bomb. And when Truman tells him about it, he plays his cards very well. He's not surprised. He doesn't act like he's afraid of it. And he says, good, I'm glad you have it. Go blow Japan up. And so it kind of backfired on Truman there. He thought he had an upper hand. He thought he had something that Stalin didn't know about. And as a matter of fact, the Russians are already working on developing their own atomic weapon at that point. It won't be too long in the future when they do develop and test their own atomic weapon. And so it's not that big of a deal. You know, Truman thought he had the trump card, and most people would, having seen the tests and how destructive this weapon is, and unaware, perhaps, that the USSR is testing and developing their own. He thought that he had something that could kind of push them into their place and allow him to do what he wanted with them, especially, he thought, after they saw the atomic weapon used on Japan. But Russia didn't budge. Russia didn't flinch. Stalin didn't flinch because he already knew and he had his in development, and he was confident that before those types of weapons would be used, he would have his own, and then he could use them in retaliation. And now it's important to remember that in World War I or World War II, at the end of World War II, and when the Cold War is beginning, atomic weapons have to be delivered by airplane. There aren't missiles yet to deliver them. Those will come later. And so you have to be within flying distance of your enemy. You have to be able to fly a plane over their land, actually drop the bomb, and then it'll blow up and kill everybody. And so there's going to be a great deal of jockeying for control of land, because you want to have land that puts you close enough to your enemy's vulnerable places, their capitals, their production centers, so that you can fly a bomb over and drop it. You're not really a threat with an atomic weapon at the end of World War II if you have no way to deploy it. And you have to deploy it with airplane, with a plane. And so there is a great deal there's going to be some jockeying for position. Winston Churchill will make a famous speech after he's no longer prime minister. So the way the government works in Britain is, in order for you to be elected prime minister, you have to be part of the leading party. And the leading party then will establish a government with a prime minister and a cabinet and other officials. Well, Winston Churchill's party no longer was the prominent party, and so he lost his place. He didn't get unelected or he didn't get cast out. His party lost power, and so then he can no longer be the prime minister. And so towards the end of the war, you have a switching of power, a change of power. And so Winston Churchill then comes over to Missouri and he delivers a very famous speech in which he talks about Russia having erected an iron curtain from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. And that phrase, Iron Curtain, will become key throughout the Cold War to describe Russia's tactics, to describe Russia's policies, in order to shut out the West, in order to shut out ideas that are different than the ideas they want their people to have. And so Russia's idea is to control thoughts, to control ideas. If they can control ideas, if they can can get people to believe and think the way they want them to believe and think they can control them. Incidentally, the United States and the other NATO nations, what will eventually become the NATO nations, are going to try and do the same thing. They realize that they really don't want to fight another war. Neither side wants to fight another war, and this is crucial in our understanding of how the Cold War is going to work. There are a few people, like Winston Churchill, thought the Soviets were going to invade. He thought they were going to attack, and that they were going to come in, and that they were going to begin another ground war. There were many people who felt that way. The United States and other countries, other groups, were afraid that the USSR was going to become too powerful. However, there were enough people who recognized that this is probably going to be a war of ideas, a war of concepts, that we were able to avoid, again, that conflict that many people wanted, like George Patton. General George Patton wanted the conflict to continue. But the United States is afraid that the USSR is going to become too powerful. And what they saw a couple moments of weakness. Now, here you are. Here is what Europe looked like at the beginning of the Cold War. All right, these would be the NATO nations in the blue. Eventually, you're going to have more nations added to it. Here will be eventually the Warsaw Pact nations. They're not called that in the beginning, but these red nations will become the Soviet Union. And here you're going to have the NATO nations, the good guys, the blue, truth, justice, and the American way, as Superman would put it. And then you're going to have the evil, atheist communists. Although that's not entirely true. Most of them are not evil, many of them were not atheists, and some of them weren't even communists. And the same thing is going to be true all throughout the other blue countries. And so what has happened is part of this war of ideas is you always cast the other nation or the other group in as negative a light as you possibly can, or you take something about them and you highlight it and you make that a negative thing. Like, communism in and of itself is not a bad idea. It may not be a very good way to run a country in the real world, but it doesn't make you evil if you're a communist. Now, there are people who are communists who are evil. Joseph Stalin, good example. But just because you're a communist doesn't make you evil. Just like simply because you believe in democracy and simply because you believe in capitalism rather than socialism or rather than communism, it doesn't make you a good guy. It doesn't make you not evil. There are plenty of evil capitalists. There are plenty of evil people who believe in democracy, who think democracy is the way to go. And so just because you're a communist or you believe in capitalism, it doesn't make you good or bad. That's completely irrelevant. And what happened is we began to define people based on their politics, based on their economics, and we began to define them in certain ways. For example, if you were a communist, automatically you were a godless, baby-killing, blood-drinking, threat to the entire world. And the same thing would become true in the propaganda that the communists or that the Soviet Union would be putting forward. And neither side is right. Neither is true. And so we have to begin to look at this. Now, it's easier when we're looking back, but we have to look at this as though there's real people with real concerns, and they're all afraid. They're all afraid of what can happen. Anyway, so back to this idea of the United States looking for weakness. The United States is afraid that the USSR is going to become too powerful. And what they're going to see over here is, you notice that there are some white countries. They do not join the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia is a perfect example. Albania down here will withdraw later from the Warsaw Pact. But Yugoslavia in the early part of the Cold War, and later Hungary and Czechoslovakia are both going to try and get out of the USSR. Well, Yugoslavia never joins. There's a leader in Yugoslavia called Tito, and he keeps Yugoslavia out. He sets himself up kind of as a totalitarian dictator, but he keeps them out. There are other neutral nations, Sweden and Finland, who are not caught up in all of this, but these are regions where the Soviets had great influence and they managed to stay neutral. So the United States sees an opportunity. Yugoslavia won't join the USSR. And so Truman develops what we call the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine stated that the United States would do everything within its power to stop the Soviet expansion during the Cold War. In other words, we would help all the nations who wanted to resist communism, who wanted to resist being annexed into the Soviet Union. And that's in particular going to be down here, Greece and Turkey. The Soviets were trying to come into Greece and take it over and come into Turkey and take it over, because there's a big power vacuum down here after the war. And the United States, there's a economic depression down here. There's a lot of difficulty down in this region, and the Soviets wanted to take advantage and just kind of march their soldiers down there, and poof, now you're Russian. Well, they didn't want to be. And so Truman and the United States, Truman is the one who put this proposition forward, and it was in effect all the way up until the Cold War ended, that the United States would do everything in its power to keep communism out of a country in which the Soviets were trying to instill communism. And so they would begin sending money. They would send soldiers. They would begin fighting in various places. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, other wars or other conflicts that don't have names. The United States would begin sending money through the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan's idea with the Marshall Plan was to send money back to all the countries who were devastated from World War II, including Germany. So anybody who was hurt by World War II in Europe, the United States was going to send money. They sent something like $160 billion over into Europe. It's just a massive amount of money. And they even offered it to Russia. And so you see here the Marshall Plan, it's kind of like you're pulling in two different directions at once. Truman says, we'll blow you up. If you try to put communism in other countries, we're going to fight you any way and every way we can. And then the Marshall Plan comes along afterwards, and the Marshall Plan says, hey, we're willing to help you. And this is part of the problem in these different types of communications. Which one do you listen to? Well, you probably listen to the one with the guns, simply because money doesn't kill you, but weapons do. And so the United States, in trying to jockey for position and vie for peace at the same time, it's kind of self-defeating. It wasn't very good thinking. We didn't think that all the way through. And the Soviet Union is going to run into their own problems very similar to that, where you have different ideas about how to handle things. Some people are terrified about the possibility of all-out war. Other people are striving for peace. And it's just going to be this constant back and forth, comedy of errors in trying to arrive at peace. When one side is willing to talk peace, the other is not, and then when the other finally comes around, the first one isn't anymore, and it's just sad to look back through history and see how many times peace could have happened, but because of miscommunication and mistrust and other issues, it doesn't. So the Marshall Plan is going to send money, offer money to the European countries, including Russia, and Russia will reject the money, and they will not allow any country under its influence to receive the money, which is unfortunate because it could have helped. The Marshall Plan again. The Marshall Plan is to help by sending money over to Europe. You're going to need to know about that probably for a test. It's very important. All right, in 1948, again, in 1948, Czechoslovakia voted to leave. The Czechoslovakian government was left in place after the war. It's red right here because we're already talking Warsaw Pact. You look, that's 1955. We're talking Warsaw Pact time. But at the beginning of the Cold War, Czechoslovakia would have been white, maybe candy striped like that. They were kind of in, but not really. They were allowed to vote as to what they wanted to do. Well, Czechoslovakia voted, and they voted to leave. So the Soviet Union says, oh, no, I'm so sorry, we let you vote, but we thought that you knew what you were supposed to vote for. And so the Soviet Union will send in soldiers. It will be a bloody takeover by a group of communists backed by the USSR, and they will take over Czechoslovakia. And it's because they don't trust what will happen if Czechoslovakia were to join the other side. Probably nothing would have happened. They probably would have established their own government. Probably somebody would have come in, like Tito, and formed some kind of totalitarian state. Who knows what would have happened over there. But Russia comes in and says, no, you can't do that. So this is going to force the Allies, or force what would become the NATO powers, France, Britain, and the U.S. primarily at this point, to form what we call Trizonia. And Trizonia is going to be the merging of those regions. Remember back over here, those three regions. Trizonia, at first it's Bizonia with just the United States and Great Britain, but then France wants to play too. Hey guys, don't leave me out. So then they're going to form Trizonia. And basically what that is that's going to give you your East Germany and your West Germany. There's no Berlin Wall yet, doesn't come till 1961, but it's going to give you distinct sections within Berlin. Well, the Soviet Union doesn't like this because it seems like everybody's ganging up on them, and they could take everybody one at a time, but if everybody gangs up, it'll be more difficult. At this point, If the Soviet Union, if all-out war had broken out, the Soviet Union probably would have won. They had more soldiers, they had more equipment, they had as good or better weapons, and so if all-out war had happened in the early 50s, late 40s, the Soviet Union probably would have won. Good thing it didn't happen. I don't know what the outcome would have been, but it would be different than it is today. And it's interesting that they didn't do that. The Soviet Union did not want all-out war. The Soviet Union just wanted to protect itself, just like the other countries wanted to protect themselves. And so they take Czechoslovakia because they're afraid. They establish, the other group establishes Trizonia, and so Russia, feeling pressure then, afraid that East Germany, this whole section here, will fall into West German hands because East Germany is going to vote, and many of the vote, a large percentage of the vote will be to join West Germany because the Germans want to be unified. It's not necessarily that they're choosing one side over the other, although fewer and fewer people will want to be communist as time goes on because they will be treated so poorly, because ideas and freedom of expression and things like that will be suppressed. It's interesting that when communism began, they were fighting against their idea being suppressed, and then they eventually become the ones suppressing ideas. It's interesting how things go in circles like that. They're going to decide to blockade Berlin. Okay, fine. We control East Germany. You have parts of Berlin, but we're not going to let you send food or supplies there anymore. This will begin what is called the airlift, the Berlin airlift. The United States and other countries will send airplanes full of supplies over, and they'll land in Berlin, they'll drop off supplies. And basically they're supplying all the people there with what they can fly in on an airplane, because the Soviets won't let them drive through East Germany. They can't keep them from flying to Berlin, but they can keep them from driving through East Germany. And they're going to get tired of doing that after a few, almost a year, and then they're going to lift the blockade and everything will kind of go back to normal. In 1952, interestingly enough, so that's happening in 1949. The Berlin airlift and the blockade is all in 1949. So a couple years later, Stalin will offer a proposal, Joseph Stalin will offer a proposal to end the division in Berlin, to actually end the division in Germany, to allow Germany to become united again. And it's not accepted by the West because they don't trust him. And so here again, you have an opportunity for peace. This would have been a huge step forward in repairing relationships between the East and the West, and uniting Germans together. And nobody wanted to do it on the West. So here the blue guys are the bad ones. And the red guys, as far as we can tell from the documents and the things that we have from history, this seems to be a genuine offer by Stalin. He is trying to avoid what he thinks would be catastrophe for his nation, for the world. And it seems like he genuinely is trying to make an offer of peace. It's not accepted. So both sides are going to be back and forth, with overtures of peace, trying to make things work. That's always going to be rejected because of a lack of trust. Somebody will make a peace offer, it will be rejected, so then they get stuck in their head, these guys want to fight. And so then when they come back with a peace offer, they're like, no, I tried that, you didn't want it. Now you're just trying to soften me up so you can blow me away. You have to remember, that actually happened to Russia in World War II, right? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where Germany and Russia said, let's be friends, we won't fight each other. And then a year and a half, 2 years later, boom, Germany's all invading Russia up in their base. And so it's dangerous. Russia is terrified that if they make any kind of move towards peaceful relationship, that they're going to pay for it with blood. It happened in World War II. And so the fact that Stalin is willing to offer anything, it's a big step forward for him. And it's just not seen that way. And so it's going to go back and forth and back and forth. In response to some things that begin happening, Truman is going to sign the National Security Act, which will create the CIA and a couple other government agencies. And it's going to change the way that federal government money can be spent. Before, there were many restrictions on how federal money could be spent, on government money. It was much more in line with the way that the Constitution was lined up. Not perfect, because Roosevelt changed things drastically. Things will change even more during the Cold War with the justification that we're trying to defend the world. Really not the United States' job when you look at the framework for the Constitution. It's not the federal government's job to defend the world. It's to provide for the common defense of the states. And so you kind of have to stretch it out to say that we're defending the country by being offensive. Sometimes maybe you have to do that. You know, I don't want to get into constitutional law discussions at this point, just kind of what happened. And so you're going to see changes in the way that federal power is exerted, federal money is spent, and organizations like the CIA will be put in place. So the CIA has a birthday around this time, the beginning of the Cold War, and it's going to change the way that the world works. The CIA is going to try and fight this war of ideas. One of the things that will happen in Europe is there are going to be radio free will be put into place, or free radio for Europe. The idea is going to be an offense or defense with weapons and offense with ideas. So you're going to have military might to defend yourself. We're not going to go on the offensive and attack anybody. We're going to use ideas to go on the attack. Well, what's going to happen is in 1950, another thing that's going to happen, and maybe one of the reasons why in 1952 when peace is offered, nobody wants to accept it. In 1950, Stalin will draw up plans. He will prepare, and he will launch an invasion of South Korea by using North Korea and eventually China. They were kind of his puppets for a little while. And he would invade South Korea. He believed that he could do this and that the United Nations wouldn't do anything to stop his invasion. He was very surprised. You see, there's some things going on with the UN. There were some countries that Stalin believed should be on the UN Security Council, like China, and they weren't. Taiwan was on the UN Security Council at this time instead of China, and Stalin didn't think that was right, and so he was kind of using this to push around his weight to get what he wanted on the UN. Well, he invades South Korea. He didn't think the UN would do anything about it, and he was very wrong. They send soldiers over into NATO soldiers over into South Korea, and so this is going to do a couple things. First of all, it's going to teach Stalin that he can't just go invade any place anytime that he wants, because the rest of the world isn't going to allow that to happen. They learned their lesson from World War II. Germany would just go somewhere and say, hey, we own this now, and nobody did anything. Well, that's not going to happen anymore, at least not that often. With things like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, there's not really a way to stop it. But here you have a country that was not part of the USSR as being invaded by countries that are under the direct influence of the USSR. And so the Truman Doctrine will be applied, in which the United States and her allies need to stop this at all cost. And so you have the Korean War. Starts in 1950, end in 1953. The UN will decide to halt the invasion, and it's going to force NATO, it's going to force the NATO nations to develop some kind of organized military structure. They're going to have to figure out how they're going to fight, how they're going to get all this stuff together, and so it forces NATO to become organized. And the organization that exists in NATO today is because of the Korean War. They were kind of caught off guard. They had to rush to get everything together, and now it happened. Here you are. Here's a picture of the 38th parallel. You're leaving or crossing the 38th parallel, and you're going into North or South Korea. This was the border here. China will get involved in the Korean War, and it will almost become a bigger conflict. It will almost turn into World War III. Thankfully it didn't, but it almost did. North Korea and China are ready to stop the war by 1952, but Stalin doesn't want them to stop. He wants them to keep fighting. And so the Korean War will last until Stalin dies. If you remember, Stalin tried to offer peace in 52 with Germany, and it was rejected. So Stalin probably figured, well, there goes any hope for peace. Let's just keep fighting. And then he forces North Korea and China to keep fighting, which is going to stress their relations. And after Stalin dies, China is going to leave. And there will be a Russo-Sino split, is what it's called. It's going to be very important. Talk about it in a little bit. Okay, the armistice in Korea will be signed in July of 1953. Very important. No peace treaty. The Korean War is still happening. It's still going on. Started in 1952. The fighting stops in 53. There's an armistice, but there's no peace treaty. There's still a border. There's mines everywhere. There's still military that are facing off, and they're constantly, vying for superior position. It's just under an armistice. That means the conflict is still going on. So at any day, at any time, North Korea could invade South Korea, South Korea could invade North Korea, and the fighting could begin again. That's why when things kind of get hairy over there, when North Korea starts doing silly things, launching missiles, war exercises, whatever, the whole world kind of holds its breath because there's never been a peace treaty signed. And even if there was a peace treaty, it doesn't mean war wouldn't happen again, but the Korean War is still happening. It's still going on. And so it's interesting when we think about that. Kim Il-sung, who is the leader of Korea at the time, North Korea, will establish a totalitarian state. It still exists today. You have his son and then his grandson, who is now the leader in North Korea. And every once in a while he makes the news for doing something crazy. But that's why they're in power, is because after the Korean War, when the Soviets didn't get along with them, Kim Il-sung just decided, you know what, I don't need you guys, I'm going to make my own country. And he did. All right. So here is the militarized Europe around the time of Stalin's death. Look at these troop numbers. You have 1.3 million soldiers basically here in East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia. You have 500, almost 600,000 soldiers down here. You have 1.2 million soldiers up here. And so when you begin to look at the Allied numbers, there's not a single area where there's over 1 million, but there are lots of soldiers in this region. Interestingly enough, this Cold War is going to draw generations of Americans into conflict. My grandfather fought in the Korean War. My father was stationed in Germany when it was still divided. And so much of the U.S. military will be drawn into these different regions, these different conflicts, and it's going to become a big part of our history. And because it's a big part of our history, it makes it very difficult for us to move forward until people are willing to forgive, or enough time has passed that we kind of forget the wounds. We don't become stupid. We don't want to be silly, and we don't want to make the same mistakes. But as situations are less emotional, we are better able to move forward. And so that's probably going to have to happen. Nikita Khrushchev will take control of Russia after Stalin's death. He will begin to de-Stalinize the USSR. Shocked everybody. Everybody thought he was going to be another Stalin, but he wasn't. He actually said that Stalin's totalitarian rule of the country was anti-communistic. People about threw up when they heard that. They were so surprised. He began to end gulags, and he started renaming cities. Joseph Stalin was kind of like Alexander the Great. Stalingrad, yeah, that's named after him. And all throughout these other regions, there was like Stalin City, Stalinia, Stalinovsky. There's all these different Stalin places. Stalin Park, Stalin Motor Park, Stalin Loves Everybodyville. Weird names. Stalin Love Everybodyville, not a real place. I made that one up. There's going to be all these different places that are named after Stalin. And Khrushchev comes by and changes all the names. We're not naming anything after Stalin, because this isn't about a person, was Khrushchev's argument. This is about an idea. That was pretty popular, actually. But Khrushchev is going to do some things that are unpopular. And Khrushchev is many times going to seem to be talking out of both sides of his mouth. But again, it's because sometimes they're afraid, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're not. And so, who knows? Who knows motivation for many of the things that are said? Who knows why they're going to be said? It's a very confusing time in world history. Khrushchev, for instance, will say in one breath, we need to have peaceful coexistence. And in the very next breath say, we will bury you. He will say, we need to find peaceful solutions, diplomatic solutions. And then in the very next breath, he will say, we could annihilate the United States and destroy any city in the world that we want. What are you doing? You can't have peaceful cohabitation while you're threatening to destroy the other people. It doesn't make sense. And so he was kind of a loose gun as far as his mouth was concerned. And even though he had some good ideas and he did some things that were helpful, he probably hurt the situation more than he helped it. He made it very difficult. China and Russia will split in 1956, largely because of what happened with Korea, and also because China doesn't like Khrushchev. The China, Mao Zedong, is very similar in totalitarian power to Stalin, and he liked Stalin. And so when Khrushchev comes and starts bashing Stalin, China's going to be like, no, dude, we want nothing to do with that. This is important. In 1956, Russia and China will split. This is one of the reasons why ultimately the Cold War will end the way it will, is because now you're going to have combat, of course, Cold War combat, between two different communist regimes. They're going to be arguing who's the real communist, who is really into this communism, who really is socialist, who really is, fighting for the common person. And it's going to be a key event in the Cold War because they're going to begin fighting with each other. In fact, Khrushchev will call Mao a lunatic on a throne. One of the reasons why we call him that is because he was afraid that Mao would begin war. He never does. But he was afraid that he would begin war, a nuclear war. And so Khrushchev, when you look at the way he talks and the things that he says, I think it was clear that he didn't want war. He wanted to have peace, but at the same time he felt like he had to keep up this machismo, act in order to scare people away from attacking. And so it's difficult to tell what's going on and who really thinks what, who really believes what. And so it's hard. It's just hard to tell. Okay, so remember, at the beginning of the Cold War, you had to fly an airplane to drop your bombs. Eventually, you don't have to. Russia will develop the first intercontinental ballistic missile. That's right. They did it. It was their idea. Well, we may have had the idea, but they did it. The first intercontinental ballistic missile, game changer, because now you can sit in Russia and push a button and blow up the United States without having to fly a plane over there. You launch a missile, it's an intercontinental ballistic missile. What it does is you launch the missile, it leaves the Earth's atmosphere, it can go all the way around the world, re-enter the Earth's atmosphere anywhere you want, and then deliver its payload. And so you can literally shoot a missile to anywhere on Earth. Because what you do is instead of trying to travel across the globe, you just shoot it straight up. It goes up into space, orbits the Earth, and it comes back down wherever you want it to. Very terrifying. There's a reason why school children were taught to hide under their desks in case there was a nuclear attack. Because for a while, the Russians could hit the United States with missiles, and the United States couldn't hit them back. And so it's very terrifying. There were instructions on how to build your own fallout shelter. There were instructions on what to do if your house is in a region hit by a nuclear weapon. All of it's stupid. Because if you're a school child hiding under a desk and an atomic weapon is dropped, you're dead. You're not going to live. Same thing with all these little, makeshift fallout shelters. They were teaching people to dig underground and cover their head with wood. And now you're dead. That's how it works. And so it was largely propaganda. Everybody was afraid because the Russians had something we didn't, and so you had to give them something to do so that they felt like they weren't helpless. In reality, they were helpless. But keep that in mind as you go through life. There will be times when people will tell you things or instruct you in things, and what you're being told to do is completely useless. It's just something to keep your mind off of the reality of the situation. That's what's going to happen. Not only are they going to launch the first ICBM, but in August of 1957, Russia will launch Sputnik, the first satellite. That changes everything. Now not only can they blow us up from anywhere, but now they have satellites. They're in outer space. Everybody's afraid they're going to colonize Mars and make that communist. It's just crazy, the fear that's created. The United States became terrified that they were behind as far as technology and science was concerned. They weren't. They just hadn't developed some things that the Russians had. We weren't behind as far as education and things like that are concerned. But a good thing is that the United States really ramped up education. They began spending a lot more money on education. And so the advances that were made, thankfully, are a result of the Cold War. The expansive education that we have, all these public universities that we have, are because of the Cold War. People were afraid that we were going to get left behind, and so we had to teach our kids science and math. A downside of that is that, by and large, things that are equally important got left off, like arts and humanities and music. Those things began to take a secondary role. And unfortunately, if you begin to lose your culture, what are you fighting for? If you begin to lose your identity and the things that make you a distinct culture, what's worth fighting for? And so there has to be a balance that's struck between teaching people how to be human, teaching people how to, invest in their humanity and their culture, and then defending their rights and abilities to do that. There has to be a balance between that. And you can't have one without the other, and you can't have one to the detriment of the other. And so we have to make a balance there. Cool thing, Yuri Gagarin is the first person to orbit the Earth. He leaves the atmosphere and he orbits the Earth. He'll come back down. It's the very first cosmonaut. I think cosmonaut is pretty cool. Cooler than astronaut, actually. Astronaut, sailor for the stars. Cosmonaut, sailor in the cosmos, much cooler. Personal opinion there. I wish we had cosmonauts, but we can't because the commies did, so we had to have something different. Yuri Gagarin, first person to orbit the Earth. Bartalan Farkas is the only Hungarian cosmonaut, and the reason why he's cool is because I'm related to him. My grandmother was a Farkas from Hungary. Yeah, Bartalan Farkas. Juldog Skreches, Bartalan. So what's going to happen eventually is the United States is going to get into motion, and they're going to send people to the moon. We stuck our flag in the moon, so we own it now. We're the only nation to stick our flag in the moon, and so it's our territory. So thankfully, the moon never became a communist state. It became a democratic republic or something like that. The Apollo moon landings are the end result of the Cold War, or they are a result of the Cold War. In fact, one of the astronauts, Frank Borman, who was an Apollo 8 astronaut, he got to orbit the moon. He is one of 24 human beings to ever orbit the moon. It's kind of neat to think that only 24 people have ever done that. Frank Borman said that the Apollo moon landing was merely another battle of the Cold War. And so he recognized. I don't think he's trying to take anything away from the just the awesomeness of that, but he recognizes that by and large it was a political statement. It was, look what we did. It's like two kids fighting in a schoolyard trying to outdo one another, building sand castles or something. Look what I did. Look how big my truck is. Look how big, look how big, my lunch is. I have a better candy bar than you. That's what you're dealing with here, is groups that are trying to outdo one another in science. So it's sad that was the motivation behind the moon landing, but hey, whatever. We landed on the moon. It's awesome. So, as this conflict begins to escalate, this war of ideas, Khrushchev is going to construct the Berlin Wall. He's going to give approval to building the Berlin Wall. This will be called one of the greatest embarrassments to the Soviet ideals in the history of the Cold War. Nobody liked it, really. We think that everybody in Russia was like, yay, Berlin Wall. Actually, most people hated it, especially the people who were trapped behind it. It wasn't such a bad thing when you were free to move about and you could go and talk to people and you could visit your family who lived in West Germany, but now this Berlin Wall keeps everybody separated. Everybody hated it. Nobody liked it. It was universally unpopular. So it's a big misunderstanding to say that the Russians loved the Berlin Wall and thankfully we tore it down. No, nobody liked it. That's why before the Soviet Union collapses, the wall comes down in 1989, because nobody liked it. Not only is the Berlin Wall going to be an embarrassment, but the Cuban Missile Crisis will also be an embarrassment on many different ways. First of all, Castro tries to have some kind of relationship with the United States. He goes to Washington, D.C. after he comes into power in Cuba. He goes to Washington, D.C. and he wants to meet with Eisenhower. Eisenhower refuses to meet with him, leaves town, and sends Nixon to go talk to him. Nothing against Nixon, but he was the vice president. And that was kind of a snub. When the leader of one country comes to the United States to talk to this country's leader, he leaves. And so Castro gets upset. And then on top of that, when Kennedy is elected, Kennedy tries to take Cuba over at the Bay of Pigs, which is the United States backed some soldiers who are going to go and try and invade Cuba and take it over. And it's a huge disaster. And so Castro says, fine, I'm going to be communist now. And so, again, here you have somebody who's trying to make some kind of effort to have peace, to have diplomatic relationships, and this time the U.S. snubs him, and so he says, fine, I'm going to be communist. And so the Soviet Union welcomes him with open arms. Why? Because Cuba is like 90 miles away from Florida. If your ICBMs don't work, at least you can just fly a plane over. Basically what that means is that the Soviet Union will be within striking distance of the United States. where they'll be able to launch missiles into the United States in a matter of minutes. And so the fear was that the Russians could obliterate the United States before the United States would even have time to respond. If you've ever seen Red Dawn, the movie where the United States gets invaded, that was the fear, is that something like that would happen. So Russia will begin to install missiles in Cuba. And basically what's going to happen is Khrushchev or other people begin to realize that this is a really stupid idea. Kennedy sends some ships down there. Many people believe that, or it becomes apparent in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that John F. Kennedy would launch nuclear weapons. He would launch weapons if he thought it was necessary to protect the United States' interest. Many people believe that's why he was assassinated. I don't know. I do not claim to know that. I just know that that's part of the idea around why Kennedy was killed, is that many people believe that he would use the atomic nuclear weapons. And thankfully, even though it was a silly idea to install them in the first place, it was mostly just political jockeying, to show people, hey, look what we can do. I don't think Khrushchev ever had the intention of using those missiles. But thankfully, he saw what it was about to turn into, or somebody saw what it was about to turn into, and they took the missiles away. They uninstalled them and removed them. And so that situation is diffused. It's important to remember that nobody wanted World War III. Well, maybe a few people did, but most people did not want World War III. Propaganda from both sides makes it seem like everybody else did. The United States made it seem like, the Russians can't wait to kill all of us. And the Russians made it seem like the United States can't wait to kill everybody. But in reality, nobody wanted to kill anyone. Everybody was afraid. If you ever heard the phrase mutually assured destruction, what that meant is that everybody knew that if the war started, we're all going to die. And nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted that. So thankfully, it didn't happen. From this point, the conflict is going to spread into smaller countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, Chile, Vietnam, etc. And the United States and Russia will both be involved to different degrees. In Afghanistan, the United States will supply groups that will be fighting against the Russians. And incidentally, later we wound up fighting against them. Just goes to show you what happens. You got to be careful. And so, the Russians would supply people, we were fighting, we would supply people, the Russians were fighting. It's back and forth with indirect conflict, never direct, like the Cuban Missile Crisis again, because it almost ended the world. So the conflict is going to spread to smaller countries and be dealt with in that way. Now, the end of the Cold War, depending on who you ask, and people have very strong feelings about this, many people will say that the Cold War ended because the United States spent the Russians into extinction. Many people will credit Ronald Reagan with doing this, and much of Reagan's legacy is based on his standing up to the Russians. I'm not taking anything away from him. He did my opinion is that he did a very great job in doing what he could as president to stand up and defend and protect the country. He did a good job. However, he did not cause the fall of the Soviet Union. They did that all on their own. What happened is what you see a picture of it's called the Helsinki Accords. They were the key to the end of the USSR. Because remember, the USSR is like our federal government tying together the 50 states. Technically, or the idea is kind of that the 50 states in our country are independent sovereign nations, almost. Everywhere else in the world, the word state refers to a nation. And so when we have 50 states, we kind of have 50 nations. And the governor of each state is like the president of the nation. But then there is a federal government which links these different states together federally. And so what you have is these different nations, the states in our country, are linked together federally by a centralized government that makes sure that they all use the same money, that makes sure that they all have the same basic laws, and that's kind of how our nation is set up. Well, that's kind of what the USSR was. It was kind of like a federal government for the different Soviets. The Soviets were the governments that were put in place by the communist parties in these different countries to run the country. And so the United Soviet Socialist Republic is these Soviets united together. And that's what the USSR was all about. And so the Helsinki Accords is going to guarantee some things to these countries that are part of the Soviet Union. They promise things like sovereign equality, and the respect for the rights inherent in sovereignty. What does that mean? Well, it means that the USSR is going to recognize that each one of these countries is sovereign, just like, to some extent, a less and less extent, the states in our country used to be sovereign. Texas could decide what Texas wanted to do as far as its rules were concerned, as long as it didn't violate any of the powers expressly given to the federal government in the Constitution. Texas could do whatever Texas wanted to do. It's like the federal government trying to define marriage. They have no right to do that. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives them the right to do that. And historically, the states were the ones who did that. And each sovereign state could decide what marriage was. Frankly, my opinion is states don't have any business deciding that, but we'll get into that debate at a later time. But regardless, we can use that or see that throughout history as the states were sovereign and the federal government loosely linked them together. Throughout time, the federal government has gathered more and more power to itself, which is what the Soviet Union was doing, gathering more and more power to itself. And then in the Helsinki Accords, they kind of let go. They're like, okay, we will respect the sovereign rights of each Soviet and that they have equality. They're all equal. There's not a more important one. And so then we're also going to refrain from using force. So if you decide you don't want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore, we won't attack you and kill you. We will respect the inviolability of frontiers, borders. And that means that the Soviet Union will no longer send soldiers, Russia will no longer send soldiers into other countries to take them over, influence them, or do whatever. Now they're doing that now over in the Ukraine, but the Helsinki Accords was an agreement not to do that. They will have the territorial integrity of the states. They agreed to have peaceful settlements of disputes. In other words, we won't send soldiers in like we did to Czechoslovakia and kill everybody. We won't send soldiers like we did into Hungary. Another instance is where Hungary voted to leave and they went and they killed everybody who was opposing the Soviet Union. They agreed not to do that. They're going to have a non-intervention in internal affairs of the states, of the different Soviets. So Russia is not going to be involved in those governments anymore. They agreed to have a respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. So basically what's happening is the Soviets for so long have been clamping down on ideas, and now they're letting go. This has nothing to do with Ronald Reagan. He's not even the president yet. And ultimately what this is doing is by giving them the equal rights, by giving them the choice or the freedom for self-determination, to allow the states to cooperate with each other without going through the Soviet Union, and to abide by and fulfill international law. These were all agreements in the Helsinki Accords. Basically, the Soviet Union has said, we're not going to force you to be Soviet anymore. And so later, when other countries start to leave, it wasn't because of anything that we did. It was because of these agreements. It gave people a legal basis for standing up to the Soviet Union. Before, there wasn't one. If you stood up to the Soviet Union and you were brought to a court and you were in opposition, you would be sent off to a gulag. You'd be sent off to a prison camp. And now, with the Helsinki Accords, they couldn't do that anymore. It changed the laws in Russia. It changed the way that they operated and that they worked. This is the change. This is what happened. This is what brings about, ultimately, the dismantling of what the Soviet Union was into now Russia and nations that wanted to be connected to Russia. And so this is how the Cold War will end, with the Helsinki Accords. Not with spending them into oblivion, not with anything that went on really in the 80s, other than the fact that people in these countries began to see the way what life was like in the United States. They began to be introduced to different ideas, and they gradually decided that they liked those. And as they changed and as they voted, the Soviet Union would come apart. That's really the underlying cause. I'm not saying that Reagan didn't have anything to do with it, that the United States didn't have anything to do with it, because they did. But largely, the Helsinki Accords was the factor, the ultimate foundation for the undoing of the Soviet Union. And so that's going to kind of get us to the end of the Cold War. The relationship today between the United States and Russia and many other countries is still strained because of what happened in the Cold War. And again, many people are talking about us having a new Cold War with Russia over Ukraine and Georgia. If you remember, a few years ago, the Russia invaded Georgia, and not the state not the United State Georgia, but the country Georgia, over close actually to where Ukraine is. And so there's a lot of talk about this strained relationship, even now affecting world history, even affecting modern goings on, because the lack of trust is still there. Everybody always assumes that the other side is doing something wicked or they have some kind of malevolent intention. And when both sides are painting the other to be wicked and evil, and they expect the other side to be wicked and evil, usually you see what you want. And so, we have to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Unfortunately, we're usually good about being wise as serpents, but the innocent as doves part, and the willingness to take risk for peace, to take risk to heal wounds, is much more difficult, especially when we're afraid. And so the sad part of the Cold War is that there was opportunities for peace along the way, and they were often missed. But finally, the ideals of human rights, of equality, of sovereignty, national sovereignty, self-determinationism, fundamental freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief, thankfully those things triumphed. And whether you happen to be a communist or a capitalist or anything in between that, or anything in any other ideology, it's your right to do that. You have the freedom and the ability to choose whatever you desire. And it has to be about the discussion of ideas, not demonizing people who are different than us. That's ultimately what we need to learn from the Cold War, or one of the things we need to learn from the Cold War. And so that's where we're going to end as far as that's concerned. And for the rest of the semester, the idea will be to look at various people throughout history. And that's where we're going to take off from there.